Good morning, friends and colleagues. Welcome to the COP29 Insights Exchange, proudly presented by the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law here at the National University of Singapore. It is a great pleasure of mine to welcome my friends and colleagues, from Lisa and Beatriz, as well as Carol online, dialing in from London, and Linda, to present this event. This particular event, the COP29 Insights, is basically has almost become a tradition. This is the fourth time that APCEL has organized a just for lack of a better word, a post-mortem of the climate change conference of the parties. It started out because Lisa, Beatriz, Linda, and I are very, very concerned about the need to present and to let people know about the perspectives of developing countries when it comes to the global negotiations on keeping the world from burning beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. Today, I am very pleased to welcome my friends. Lisa is professor from the College of Law, University of Cebu. She has more than 20 years of experience in natural resources law and regulatory policy. And next to her is Professor Beatriz Garcia, who is at the Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi. Beatriz is a distinguished expert in international environmental law and has done extensive work as well as field work in the Amazon on forestry protection. Linda is our in-house expert. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center, while concurrently holding an appointment as Associate Professor at one of the top universities in Indonesia, University Gadjah Mada. Currently, I believe you are right now on the IPCC. Yes. And I love at the moment, the bio is a little bit outdated. It says that from 2018 to 2023, Linda is lead author of the IPCC 6 Assessment Report. And I believe currently you are involved in the drafting on the report for cities, right?
Special reports on cities.
Special report on cities. And we have Carol, who has joined us online. Carol was formerly a researcher with the Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law and currently pursuing her LLM in Environmental Law and Policy at University College London. And we are really delighted to have her join us as well. And she has been very kind to join us at literally 1 a.m. in London. Without further ado, I am going to hand over the floor to our first speaker, Linda. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and we are going to have a short Q&A after the first two presentations. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Jolene, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Good morning. Selamat pagi. We're starting our day with beautiful sunny day here in Singapore, and this is the first time in 4 years that we meet every year that we meet in person. Usually we do this webinar online, and this year we have the luxury to meet in person. And for those of you who would like this to be a repetition next year, please have your high hopes. Okay, so I will start with a general introduction of the results from the COP29. We all see the reports and we all see the speeches that the head of states give. It was like one of the speeches that was given, one of the first ones that was given by the president of Azerbaijan, was saying that Azerbaijan was the first country where they found an oil rig in the world. So I was like, okay, that's a very wake-up moment for everybody, right? So the COP was hailed as a finance COP. It managed to upgrade the financial goals to at least $300 billion annually by 2035. Well, it was $100 billion per year. And then this financing scheme, including public finance and private finance that were leveraged by public finance. So this financing mechanism in the COP under the Paris Agreement is led by developed countries, but decided to include also developing countries' contribution to multilateral climate finance and their own bilateral finance to be voluntarily counted. And all the states that were there in the COP agreed that they will work together toward enabling the 1.3 trillion US dollars in finance for developing countries by 2035. This 1.3 trillion US dollars is closer to the real finance that is needed, right? Not the 300 billion, but 1.3 trillion. So our next COP from Baku to Belém roadmap will muster the additional trillion. So there are three highlights that I could underline. Still on finance, the first one is still on finance. So there were a lot of discussion whether the finance should be loans or grants, or should loans be also calculated, etc. And they didn't come into like a good understanding. So I think they will still discuss about that. But they did agree on the easy access. So special circumstances for least developing countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, simplified application and disbursement processes. And then for the GST, GST global stocktake outcomes, they were very light on the fossil fuel transition. And the COP decided to defer this to the next COP. Well, they don't want to discuss that, maybe because it was very hard with the lobby of the oil and gas countries. And then for the next NDC, which is this year, 2025, we could see in the last COP, in COP29, that UAE has submitted new NDC, that UK has updated target, that Brazil has new NDC, and Indonesia pushed net zero to 2050. So initially it was 2060. But then pushed to 2050, but delay submission to the new NDC. Carbon markets were also discussed in COP29. There were some key steps towards operationalizing the Paris Agreement, Article 6 on carbon market. There were talks on internationally traded mitigation outcomes, or the ITMOs. And for the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, the PACM, we knew this as CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. So these things were discussed, and they say that the PACM can also be a source of climate finance for developing nations, with a share proceeds going towards adaptation funding to build resilience and the inevitable impacts of climate change. So adaptation was also discussed. However, the GGA that developing country negotiators were very eager to discuss was slided toward the MOI, the means of implementation. So within the adaptation discussion, they discuss more on capacity building, technology transfer, financial support, MOI indicators that was requested by developed countries and then rejected by developing countries, and enablers of implementation. So the total fund after COP29 for adaptation is 124 million US dollars. Loss and damage were also discussed. As we know, there's a Warsaw International Mechanism for LND, for loss and damage. It includes risk management, strengthening dialogue, coherence, coordination, and synergies among stakeholders, and enhancing action and supports such as finance, tech transfer, and capacity building. But the COP didn't manage to negotiate key issues of the WIM's review. And again, it's one of the issues that is delayed to 2025, to Bonn, specifically Bonn 2025. So the Fund for Responding Loss and Damage, FRLD, is 759 million US dollars, not very big. Outside the negotiating tables, they have several achievements. Among others, the Declaration on Reducing Methane from Organic Waste. There were 159 signatory countries and delivered 100 national plans with methane targets, committed 2 billion US dollar grants for methane abatement. More than 100 countries agreed to increase global energy storage by 6-fold. And there's a continuity of coalition to bring previous COP presidencies and other international organizations. This includes UN Habitat, WHO on Climate and Health, UN Food Agriculture Organization on the role of farmers and addressing climate change. So what about Indonesia? Since I'm from Indonesia, we'll focus on Indonesia. During COP29, there were positives and negatives going on in the country. And as you can see, there's more negatives than positive. But the positive side, we push forward from 2060 to 2050 for our net zero. That's very commendable. And then Indonesia pledged to build 75 gigawatts of renewable power plants within the next 15 years. So the negative side of it, when we look at what things are going on in the country, we can see that banks and companies are still investing and paying for fuel coal capacity expansion. Even like some research are saying that big companies such as Adaro is still paying for the expansion of coal power plant in the country, and the PTBA commissioned 1.32 gigawatt coal power plants. So these things are not exactly in line with what the government was pledging in the COP29. So based on our APCEL's Indonesian series in 2024, so we had a webinar series and hybrid in 2024, we saw that to achieve net zero in 2050 and Indonesian NDC, the country needs to address several things. The first one is massive systemic challenges, such as high reliance on coal and to reduce deforestation. Second one is increasing the slow pace of renewable energy development. The third one is addressing financing gaps. And the fourth one is socioeconomic implication on transitioning to a low carbon economy. So what are the cautions? The cautions here for the country is that there is an inundation of environmental objectives with economic priorities. So it is as if the country is doing something very good for the environment, but with very heavy economic agendas, right? Such as the growth influence of state-owned enterprise and local conglomerates within the energy and natural resources sector, which brings policies that prioritize domestic players and achieve specific national objectives. As you can see, there are 4 national objectives, but only one is very good for the environment, which is accelerating the energy transition. The rest is very oil and gas and coal heavy. So it's a new administration, but with old problems. So what are the problems, right? The problems here are corruption, unclear land tenure, regulatory inefficiency, declining trust in government, and democratic backsliding. So the government needs to address this with a lot of transparency, inclusivity, reform, accountability, and innovation in addressing governance and development challenges that are needed. So what I found in Indonesia, there's a lot of superficial environmentalism. What is superficial environmentalism? It's performative gestures, greenwashing, and piecemeal actions that light of death and will pose a barrier to genuine sustainability. So what do we do to not have this in the country? The first one is that corporations, including state-owned enterprises, must abandon greenwashing tactics and start investing in genuine sustainability supply chains, renewable energy, and circular economic models. The government implement robust enforceable legislation that prioritize long-term environmental health, educational system. People need to be educated to be able to distinguish between meaningful action and superficial efforts. And media and society have a critical role in holding both public and private actors accountable, exposing hollow initiatives while championing impactful projects. So as a closing, some of you might hear that the Ministry of Energy and the Envoy of Energy and Climate Change in Indonesia has proposed the country to leave Paris Agreement, withdraw from Paris Agreement, just like the US. If this comes in the question and answer session, I will try to answer that, but I will give this back to Jolene. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Linda. I love the way you end on a cliffhanger and know exactly where we're going to go with the Q&A. It is indeed a issue that everyone has been talking about, right? I mean, in the context of the 72 hours of crazy talk about terrorists and all, there's also been a lot of fear about whether there is a domino effect once Trump has not received proper advice on how you could actually withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But thank you very much for that. And as you can see, our approach in this series is to try to connect what's been happening at the global negotiations with what it means for domestic policy. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Beatriz, and you have your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll start by thanking my dear colleagues and friends, Jolene, Linda, and Lisa. I'm very, very happy to be here for the first time in person. Also thank the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law for this kind invitation. And thank you all for your time and for being here today. So after Linda's great overview about what happened at COP29, what I wanted to discuss with you is really the outcomes of this COP beyond climate finance and the road for COP30 in Brazil. Okay, so I'll start with carbon markets. So what has been agreed? We now have an environmental and human rights safeguards for carbon markets, for the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So what does it mean? It means that participants to this carbon crediting mechanism will have to identify, avoid, and minimize risks associated with carbon projects. So apart from that, we'll also have an appeals and grievances procedure. So now, again, those affected by carbon projects will be able to file complaints and also appeal decisions related to carbon marketing transactions. So these are two important additions to previous rules that have been discussed under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Right, so why do we need safeguards? What are the risks? So consider, for example, carbon projects developed in forest areas in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and other countries involving local communities, indigenous peoples. So the main risks of those projects, and we see those things happening in Brazil, for example, particularly in the voluntary carbon market, is that first, there are issues with the free, prior, and informed consent of local and indigenous communities. So these projects, sometimes and many times, they are taking place without the prior consent of communities or without proper participation of those communities. So this is a first risk. Second, unclear, insecure land tenure, as Linda was mentioning, is an issue in Indonesia, also an issue in Brazil. So some of those projects are being developed, for example, in forest areas, in public forest areas, or indigenous people's lands, without observing land tenure rights and also agrarian law. So this is also an issue. And finally, there are issues associated with benefit sharing. So some of those projects are being developed with the benefits which arise out of the selling of carbon credits, not being shared with indigenous communities, local communities. So it's more in the hands of investors, project developers, less in the hands of the local communities who should be benefit from those projects. So the idea of those safeguards is really to try to protect, especially local and indigenous communities, from those risks. So that's the idea. Right, so if we think of now we have a global carbon market mechanism under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So what are the implications for countries? So basically, those carbon projects, they will attract finance and technology, particularly for developing countries. And we saw this happening, for example, with the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And what will also going to happen is that countries will start developing national laws and policies to regulate domestic carbon markets. And we saw this happening in Brazil in particular. We have a very recently adopted law, 15042 of 2024, which established the Brazilian emissions trading system. So basically this law is regulating how carbon credits are issued, how they are traded, how to monitor the commercial operations around carbon credits, and also to ensure compliance with national and international law. So we'll probably see this happening in other countries as well, countries establishing their national ETS, emissions trading schemes. Right, so I wanted to discuss a little more about two key ongoing processes that will be, relevant to all COPs, but also relevant to COP29. The first one being the biannual transparency reports. And for the first time, we had those reports being submitted at COP29. And this is done under the umbrella of the Enhanced Transparency Framework of Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. So basically, these reports, they are intended to track progress and the reporting and the progress of countries in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. We also had at COP29 the Baku Transparency Platform, which is an initiative that has been created to really enhance participation of countries in the ETF, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and to also provide transparency support, especially for developing countries in, for example, developing their reports, collecting data, and doing that in an effective way, right? So why am I bringing those things to your attention? Because both the transparency reports, but also this platform, they will, at the end of the day, they will be useful for the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, right? Because they will be tools for the committee to assess compliance and implementation of the Paris Agreement. So basically, with those tools, we'll be having information provided by countries that is more clear, transparent, comparable. So all these things will be helpful for the Implementation and Compliance Committee and to assess compliance of parties, compliance to the Paris Agreement. I'll now move to another ongoing process, which is the nationally determined contributions. So as you all know, the NDCs, they are basically a national climate action plan. So under NDCs, countries will say how much, what are their targets in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and they also have to inform what are the strategies, the measures that they will be taking to meet those targets and also the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? So as you know, NDCs are submitted every 5 years, and each round of submissions has to be more ambitious. There must be a progression. So the new NDCs have to be more ambitious than the previous NDCs submitted priorly. So just an overview of what they are, just to remind you a little bit, and then what is the timeline? And here is the timeline for the NDCs, right? So we had the first ones being submitted ahead of the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. This is the first round of submissions. The second round of submissions was 2020-21, ahead of the Glasgow meeting, right? So then we had in 2023 the global stock take, where we are assessing the collective progress of countries towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. And then the third round of submissions, they're called the NEDCs 3.0, are due now. So they are happening now, early 2025. So the idea here is to discuss those NDCs 3.0 in an interim meeting in Bonn mid-year, and also formally address and discuss those NDCs at COP30 in Brazil. Right, so what do we know about NEDCs? Where do we stand now? So as we know, in Dubai, in COP28 last year, we had the first global stock take. So as I said, this is a mechanism of the Paris Agreement to assess how well or how badly countries are complying with the Paris Agreement. So the global stock take happens every 5 years. And what we know from this, from what happened in Dubai, from this first assessment, is that we are not on track to limiting global warming to 1.5, right? And this information is based on the submissions on the NDCs provided by countries. So with this data, we're able to assess what is our collective progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in COP29, we have this information reinforced with the 2024 synthesis report of the nationally determined contributions of 2024, again saying we're not on track to meeting the 1.5 target. Right, so with all that in mind, with that background information in mind, what to expect at COP30 in Brazil. So basically in COP30, we'll have a big discussion on NEDCs 3.0 and commitments ahead. So as pointed out by the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary, he says that the new NDCs will probably be the most important documents produced so far in this century. So this is really going to define what's going to happen in the next few years, right? Okay, so COP30, as you all know, is happening in Brazil, and for the first time in a city that's within the Amazon basin, this Belém. So for being in Brazil, being in the Amazon, COP30 will probably be very much focused on deforestation, nature-based solutions, land use sector, and just transition. So when you think of nature-based solutions, I'm talking about, for example, forest conservation, restoration, things like biotrade, ecotourism. So these are things that will probably be discussed quite a lot at COP30. Also, there will be a lot of discussion, that's what we're anticipating, on climate finance, especially for forest conservation. So as you may know, Brazil has proposed a tropical forests forever fund, which is basically a fund to compensate, to pay countries, developing countries, such as Brazil, the Congo Basin, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for their efforts in protecting forests. So this is something that will, similar to the REDD+ idea, also be discussed towards making it operational, for the years ahead. So this is probably one of the hot topics, some of the hot topics of COP30. Right, so now some thoughts about what is happening in the world. And as we all know, the United States will be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. This has been announced in January this year, as we expected, right? And the issue here is that we now know that climate change mitigation and adaptation action will now have to go ahead without the United States. This is an issue also because, as you all know, the United States is a country that has an ability to provide a lot of climate finance to developing countries, and this will be an issue in the years ahead, right? So when we think about what is happening in the United States, I wanted to bring you some thoughts about what those things may mean for countries in general, but for Brazil in particular. So our fear as Brazilians is that the election of Donald Trump will actually reinforce aspirations of Bolsonaro, who is known as the Trump of the tropics, to come back to power. If not him, his supporters, right? And I'm not sure if you have been following Brazilian politics, but basically Bolsonaro was in power in 2029. And it was quite a disaster in terms of environmental protection in Brazil. So basically, he cut off all funding for environmental organizations, for enforcement action. As a result, there was a record high rates of deforestation in the Amazon and in other ecosystems as well. And a lot of illegal activities. Basically, he gave like green light for a lot of illegal activities happening, especially in the Amazon. So the thing is, with this likelihood of him coming back to power, his political agenda was basically one of opening the Amazon and other ecosystems to commercial activities, mining, oil and gas exploration, and also agribusinesses. And the fear here that we have, and we all share, is that with the far-right government, him or his supporters coming back to power, this political agenda will also be coming back to the table. So that's a big risk for Brazil, is something that we watch and see what is happening for, especially in 2026 when we'll have new presidential elections. But well, with that note, I'll probably stop here. I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you again for your time, and thank you for being here. Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. I actually have to comment both of you. I've never had the pleasure of moderating a panel where everyone speaks and ends 30 seconds before the bell rings. So I'm actually really impressed. Thank you very much for your sharing, Beatriz. And It is, and it's also wonderful to be able to have you here to share your thoughts on the road to the COP30 in your home country. So here I will take the opportunity to open the floor to take any questions. We do have one online, which I will turn to very quickly, but I would like to also take questions or comments at this point. As I said, I will be taking a number of questions at this juncture for Beatriz's and Linda's presentation, if anyone has any questions, before we go on to a plenary discussion, and if we would like to use such a grand term at the end. So if anyone would have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands and briefly give me your name and your institutional affiliation. Thank you. Hi, good morning, Elena. Welcome. If you could speak into the mic, that would be very helpful for our online attendees. Thank you.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much. I deeply appreciate your very interesting presentations. Thank you very much. Linda, I believe I have a question to you. You mentioned the vivid and ongoing discussions on whether assistance should be provided in the form of loans or rather in the form of grants. Could you please be a little bit more specific about these discussions and what is your perspective of how this should be? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take one more question from the floor and then, yes.
Hello, my name is Ashley Brosnan. I'm the Climate Counsel at the Australian High Commission. Interested in your perspectives on the robustness of the APCEL framework that's emerged from COP29, and whether it will sort of, I guess, create market mechanisms to achieve some of the goals under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And perhaps maybe if I could add to that question, Beatriz and Linda, the one question I had was, to what extent have lessons been learned about the clean development mechanism? I was actually delighted to hear that it was an appeals and grievance procedure that's been put in place. And that was something that was dear to my heart in 2008. So over to both of you, and I'll take questions from the online audience. Thank you.
Okay, so to answer the question on loan versus grant, the discussion was about whether the loan should be included in the $300 billion pot, because it's a different mechanism, right? And the developing countries didn't want loans to be included, which makes sense. But developed country wants it to be included because it's also money given, even though they will get it back. So so yeah, so at least for myself, we're still not clear whether or not it will be counted, loans will be counted, but so far it is still being counted. Even bilateral loans are also counted. Developing countries support also counted. So everything is still accounted for the $300 billion US dollars big loans. The second question is about the CDM, right? CDM is coming in a different name now. Oh, Article 6. Okay, Article 6 for carbon market, right? The discussion was to enable country to transport carbon credits earned from the reduction of GHG emission to help one or more countries meet their climate targets. Under Article 6, the main thing here is the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, which is the UN new high integrity carbon crediting mechanism. And this allows countries to raise ambition and implement national action plans more affordably. For example, a company in one state can buy their carbon credit from a company in another state under PACM. And whether it will be very different from CDM, I'm not quite sure. But the second company then will be using them to comply with its own emission reduction obligation or to help it with their net zero targets in their country or in their company even. So the details of it I'm not quite sure yet whether it's very different from CDM, but from my perspective, it's still very close to CDM.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda. Very good question about how robust is the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, the rules and standards. So I guess having rules, having standards and a grievances procedure is all good news and it's all necessary. But what I see from my experience, particularly in Brazil and particularly in the voluntary market, for example, with the VCS, VERA, the Verified Carbon Standard, is that those standards, they're all good and necessary, but it's very difficult to put them in practice. And they're many times not enough to handle problems that are on ground. For example, issues related to irregular land tenure, projects being developed in areas where they shouldn't be happening without consent or without participation of communities. So these things are still happening despite the existence of those safeguards and rules and measures. So this is something that we'll have to watch out in terms of what is happening with this new market. In terms of risks and issues that we may still face and we still have, is that, as Linda was saying, I think we tend to have mechanisms that are very complex, time-consuming, as we had with the CDM, and Jolene has done quite a lot of research on that, and we probably still have similar problems. And what means is that sometimes, because there's all this complexity and it's all very also, it all requires a lot of effort, most of carbon projects, they in the end, they become quite complicated and not really affordable. So what we see also in practice is that, for example, communities, indigenous peoples, who have forest areas, who can have this kind of projects, they just don't have the money or the capacity really to develop those projects. So they can only have those projects with a lot of help from international organizations, NGOs. So without that help, that would be quite complicated. So we'll probably see those things still happening with the new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. We do have two questions online, but I thought that given the nature of the questions on the NDCs as well as the conversation, which is a very important conversation on the indigenous peoples, I will park that for the broader discussion, as I think Lisa, for example, Lisa would also have views on, and Carol as well will have views on these two questions. And perhaps if there are there any other questions or comments on, yes, please. Would you turn on the mic, please? And if you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
I'm Tarini Mehta from India. My question is not directly about the COP and Paris Agreement. It's linked to that. I've been doing research on ESG norms and corporate accountability and trying to get corporates on board with all this. And so I'd love to hear your perspectives, since you'll have maybe more of a meta view, since you're looking at it from the Paris Agreement point of view. How far do you feel current ESG norms are actually contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Because there's some research coming out from China. There's another research which came out with about 40 countries saying that it has reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but then there's other research and reports about greenwashing and that it's not enough and single materiality is an issue. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on that.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. And perhaps because Lisa and Carol haven't had a chance to join the conversation, I'll let Lisa and Carol have a first go at your question. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is on ESG, right, norms and how far it has, achieved its goal of reducing greenhouse gases. So I know, like, there's in the country, like where I come from, this is the Philippines, we're just starting to like ensure like corporation provide some safeguards when they, indulge in these projects that maybe some of us would call like, because I work in the non-government sector, which we also try to, assess whether they're really, you would say, truthful in their, in their declarations, in their work in ESG, and in trying to comply with ESG norms. And we sometimes call them out as, these are simply greenwashing efforts on their part. And we try to involve for us, government institutions like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which actually hold, sway their powers, or they can manage and, ensure the compliance of these companies. Now, we've discussed with the Securities and Exchange Commission certain mechanisms for reporting. Like, for instance, they're now required to have sustainability reports. But to go just beyond saying like, no, we've done this, we've done that, but of course, going deeper into that and assessing, like they already have all these reports coming in from corporations. So we've urged them to assess whether these reports are really making a dent on, the goals that we want to achieve for greenhouse gas emissions. So we're still like in the monitoring stage and, trying to assess, the data, which now I think is substantial, and the government will have certain information that can, make them at least move forward in trying to ensure the compliance of these companies.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Carol, would you like to comment on this?
Sure. So I think the conversation has also moved from ESG, which is more about indicators, to sustainability as well. And we also see that there are calls for transition plans for larger companies. So I think it's definitely going to result in a reduction in emissions. The question is how much, given that the sustainability and climate transition plan frameworks, they do emphasize a change in governance structure of the companies, and companies to examine their supply chain structures. So there are going to be downstream and upstream implications for these companies. The question, I suppose, is like Lisa said, to prevent greenwashing and to make sure that the information that these companies provide are verifiable, so that change can actually happen. But I do think there is a general drive towards corporate purpose and a change in governance methods.
Thank you. I like that optimism. I'm really hopeful for that. Beatriz.
So that's a good question. What I see happening, especially in the land use sector, a lot of corporate committees on, for example, zero deforestation efforts, companies, especially in global value chains, companies making commitments to have good due diligence processes in place, avoid commodities, or being more careful with commodities associated with deforestation, such as soy, cattle, timber, and others. So I think these are all important efforts and measures. I'm not sure if I am as optimistic as Carol, maybe because what I think it's still happening is that it's very aspirational. It's still in that stage where we have reports, we have commitments, and we have statements, but we don't see a lot of results on ground. For example, there are reports from Forest Trends analyzing what is really happening, how companies are assessing their progress in meeting those commitments, and it's first of all hard to track how this is being done, and many companies are not really achieving what they are saying they will be doing or will be achieving. So there is a bit of a gap between what is being said and what is being happening in practice, and this is something that makes us concerned about the legitimacy or the real drive for things to really change, especially in terms of if we think of global the value chains for those, when we talk about commodities associated with deforestation, but human rights issues and not only environmental issues, but other issues that are associated with international trade and other matters.
I'll go very quick, but I agree with what the other speakers have already highlighted. I would like to add, in Indonesia, the companies do voluntarily make alternative business strategies in order to lower their GHG emissions. However, whether they implement it or not, it's again another question, right? In the developing countries, and also it hinges upon the policy of the government. The government of Indonesia right now is developed a very strong downstream natural resources industries. We call it hilirisasi, and it sort of giving a blanket of safety to companies to do whatever they want, like local companies, right? So again, it's everything is connected in a circle. So if the government do not have very good policies, how are the companies going to do whatever they want? If there's no enforcement or there's no check and balances from government, from the people, stakeholders, they need to make sure that these companies are doing what they said they would, and reliably, like, not lying, of course. When, it's kind of the awareness level that we need to work on, because once you understood that everybody needs to do this together, and then it will work. But if some people are still thinking about the profit for right now and not thinking about the future, then it's kind of hard.
Thank you very much. That was a really thoughtful and also gave me a lot of food for thought for the future, for further conversation. We'll now turn to Professor Lisa, who will speak to us about COP29 and its implications for the Philippines. Over to you, Lisa.
Hello. Thanks, Jolene. First of all, I'd like to thank APCEL, of course. It's been years since I've been, here, and I'm glad I'm back here. And thank you, of course, our, almost a tradition yearly chat, about after COP, each COP. And I think this year will be our 5th one, if ever it happens after COP 30. So thank you so much. So I will be talking about, of course, mainly on the implications of COP29 results to the Philippines. And first of all, I'd like to also share with you my background. It's not really pure academia. I also work in with an international organization focused on ocean biodiversity conservation in the Philippines. So I work with Oceana, where we focus on campaigns to achieve policy reforms, especially in terms of protecting our marine biodiversity. So so this has been discussed already by Linda, but as to its implication to the Philippines, I guess we were hopeful about the climate finance targets that that COP29 aim to achieve, because this will aid countries like the Philippines, which are, of course, as you know, very, very vulnerable to climate change. And civil society organizations in the Philippines also argue that without these ambitious targets that we set for COP29, Philippines and other similar countries will actually struggle to invest in the necessary adaptation and resilience measures that are needed for us to really address our vulnerabilities. These are some of the results, as mentioned. This is just a summary of those, and mainly you can see that, of course, for the talks were mainly a failure to really achieve something substantial for us, and especially for countries like the Philippines. And I heard a joke in the Philippines, actually, that they say that the only result that they've achieved every time COP happens is really to set the next schedule for the next COP. So yeah. we've been quite very critical about it. So, but as you know, Linda mentioned this earlier that the loss and damage mechanism has been created. And of course, the COP has achieved some sort of commitments and set some dollars for the loss and damage fund. And as a result, also, the Philippines accepted the host country agreement of the loss and damage fund board. So after that, the Philippine president immediately actually signed one of the fastest legislation I've seen in recent years in the Philippines. Of course, when it comes to this kind, the Philippines are always very they will always welcome initiatives like this. So we have now Republic Act number 12019, which is a national law which creates the institutional mechanism to manage the funds that will come in where the Philippines is asked to manage. So just to show to you the Philippines how we are. Mentioned already, we're very vulnerable to natural hazards. So many of our cities, so we're an archipelago, a smaller one compared to Indonesia. But of course, we have a huge population, about 110 million already. And, and so many of the population live in our coasts and are usually, the ones that will first bear the brunt of the effects or impacts of climate change. Last year, in fact, I think before the COP, we had like 5 typhoons in 1 week. So that was really like the first time it happened. So you could see how, it really, affects many people, including Filipinos who depend directly on our natural resources for their livelihood and survival. So, yeah, we know that, the Human Development Index value of the Philippines is very, very low. So we have, poverty, we have low education, which is quite a challenge as well. We have development challenges like aside from climate change, environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, plus the hazards, exposure and vulnerability. And what also is really important to note is every time a typhoon hits, which are getting more often now, we have actually insufficient local coping and adaptive capacities. And our country unfortunately has borrowed millions and trillions, and we will be buried in debt for the next 20 or so years because of how low our coping mechanisms is. And so yeah, so I think this goes to show how really climate finance is very important to a country like the Philippines. But for the Philippines, we've made significant efforts in building our climate change resilience. So this will actually show to you how, while international commitments, treaties are very important because it actually helps push our government to do, to do something at the national level in order to comply with their commitments, such as, for instance, coming up with a climate change action plan, adaptation plan, implementation plan for NDCs, coupled with plans for improving the status of our biodiversity, and of course trying to ensure a low carbon economy through our Philippine Energy Plan. These are efforts that are as important as efforts that are done at the international level for us. And in terms of the energy, we are known to have high substantial capacity to move towards a renewable energy future. And however, I think our targets are still very low compared to what we would want them to be. Like, for instance, the National Renewable Energy Roadmap aims to achieve only at least 50% by 2040. So we're still very dependent on coal. Like some sectors, including the government sector, would say that we still need fossil fuel driven power, because in order to achieve energy security in the Philippines, while we try to say that we have actually abundant solar and wind power potential that has not yet been explored. In the meantime, the government has actually put in place some policies that would ensure the increase in, for instance, investments in renewable energy, like the national the renewable portfolio standards, which is a policy implemented that requires electricity supplier to source a certain percentage of their power or energy from renewable energy sources. We also have the Green Energy Option Program, which allows consumers to choose renewable energy as their source of energy for power supply. So we have feed-in tariffs, we have green finance, energy efficiency, and of course, the community-based renewable energy projects. So these are aimed at really stimulating investments and of course, development of more renewable energy sources. And of course, at the last, efforts on community base is to empower communities to actually engage in more renewable energy projects. So what are the challenges in our transition towards this a just transition towards a more renewable energy future? So despite despite our high energy potential, the country is still actually heavily reliant on coal and oil for its energy needs. We have inherent challenges for energy transition, where infrastructure is one of them. We have also investments in these infrastructure that needs to be put in place because we're heavily reliant on foreign loans, and that actually increases our debt, public debt, because of this infrastructure development. Policy support is also one challenge that we have in terms of ensuring better policy environment, where of course environment safeguards are in place, and then technical capacity. But you have to note also that the Philippines is also the only ASEAN country that has not committed to a net zero target. So you could see, like, of course, while we have the potential, the government is still very hesitant in really having a high target in terms of our transition to. So we also faced significant risks because of this, our inability to really move faster than we want in terms of transition. So we could end potentially losing up to 3% of our gross domestic product by 2050 if we don't really do anything about it. And this is just merely because of the climate change impacts that we suffer from every year. We had recently an assessment, and it's the first time that we had actually a Philippine climate change assessment that are suitable, tailor fit to our context, which is a great initiative of our government through our Climate Change Commission. And it shows to us, like, these climate change impacts will really increase in frequency and intensity over the next few decades for us. And so we are very much now getting more, at least on the ground data on where these impacts would happen, and at least we could at least ensure that we could put in place plans for adaptation. So these are also the targets, the NDC, as mentioned earlier. So the Philippines aim to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030. So, but most of these targets are conditional targets, conditioned on, of course, investments that will come in. So we're very reliant on foreign aid projects in order to help us. So actually, that's why for the initial discussion on the collective quantified goal for the climate finance strategy that will should be the core government-led financing, not loans, should be also very dependent on this one, would be dependent on that goal. So the other challenge that I'd like to enhance is about public awareness. So we need to enhance public awareness because seems like the discussions are really on the government, policy makers level with some NGO participation. But then, our challenge is increasing the awareness of the public. And of course, mainstreaming our national to local climate plans. So what are some of the perspectives? The government is really also very forward-looking in terms of adopting new legislative measures such as the Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Accounting System, which is a roadmap for us to help institutionalize natural capital accounting in the Philippines. So this would actually help us, especially in accounting for the damage that some of the impacts of climate change may have, and of course in even some of the development projects that are happening, and allow us to at least account for perhaps a system for getting damages from all these actions, and so the loss and damage mechanism can be informed through this. We have two initiatives like the low carbon economy investment bill. So this actually was just read on the floor of the House of Representatives this week. As mentioned by the champion that we talked to, this actually helps mandate large enterprises across various sectors to develop plans in order to align their goals of their plans to the goal of limiting temperature rise below 2 degrees. And they had, the champion, the legislator champion has said that it has clear milestones and targets, and there's a progressive realization of emission reduction targets over time. So this serves as a clear policy for decarbonization for industries, and I hope this will get passed in this year. Another is actually also helping us achieve more resilience in terms of the impacts of climate change, and this is what I'm personally involved in right now, which is to push for the establishment of coastal green belts all over the country. So these are mangrove forests, that are fringing our coast, that should be protected, should be managed well, especially by the local communities. So bills that are already being pushed by several sectors are what we call the low carbon economy investment bill, the climate accountability, or the CLIMA bill. So this the CLIMA bill is actually the first possible corporate climate accountability to be recognized by a state. So it has a mechanism for reparations and accountability for loss and damage. So it has provisions on due diligence, adopts a polluter pays principle, and recognizes the greater responsibility of industry by, especially by the carbon majors, and institutionalizes a climate change reparation fund. So this is one of the bills that we're looking forward to, that will also help us in ensuring corporate climate accountability. So this I'll just end with this. I think there's a critical need to mobilize and align financial resources to facilitate our just transition. We need to mitigate our nature-related risks, nature-based solutions. But of course, to emphasize also that there's a critical role for the non-state actors, or the private enterprises in these actions as well. Local communities are actually very important players in terms of our having meaningful progress in ensuring our resilience and adaptation to climate change. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think we really appreciate the sobering picture that you paint of the challenges that a country like the Philippines faces, but also a lot of the hope, right? With a lot of these very interesting and innovative legislation that could possibly pave the way for more action on climate. I will now hand the floor to Carol. Carol, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides. Can you see it well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So hi everyone. Just a disclaimer that all views are mine, because I went with the Singapore Youth Delegation for COP29. And today I just wanted to share with you about what I observed at the pavilions and about youth activity at COP29, because I thought this might give you a feel of what happened there. and also just to provide a different perspective from the other panelists. And also because I wanted to look at the pavilions also because even though some of us youths followed the negotiations, I went in the first week. The negotiations moved quite slowly in the first week because basically the finance discussion was being inserted into every possible negotiation track by developing countries. And that made it difficult to move on the negotiations because there was a deadlock. And so in the first week, the negotiations didn't move much. In fact, even on the first day, for the review of the global stocktake, there was also a discussion of whether to discuss it in relation to finance or just to discuss the global stocktake as a whole. So even though that was a question of how to place global stocktake review in the agenda, it was also hotly debated and eventually ended with a footnote that the global stocktake review does not just involve finance discussions. Okay, so I also would like to say that Linda mentioned that Azerbaijan is the first country where the oil rig was found. And indeed, one of the souvenirs that I bought from Azerbaijan was an oil rig kind of glass figure. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting that was what I got back from Azerbaijan. Okay, so this is the map of COP29, and just to give you an overview, A is where we entered from, Zone B is where the side room events were, and then Zone C and D are where meetings happened. Zone D had the press conference rooms. Zone E is where the country pavilions were, and the green color part, green zone, is where the business pavilions, mostly business pavilions were. So basically, this would be businesses and multinational corporations in Azerbaijan. So it could be like their national electricity company, or it could be, for example, a consulting company like Deloitte, basically promoting their business. There was also Baku caviar there. Yes. So yeah, essentially, I did go to Zone E most of the time to look at the Singapore and other pavilions. And just to give a bit more context about why I went to COP and the program that the Singapore government has for its youths, I went as part of the Climate Youth Development Program and the youth delegation. Basically, the government has had this program running for 2 years now. Last year was the second year. It's a collaboration by 3 government agencies, the Climate Change Secretariat, the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, and the National Youth Council. And in this program, they have 40 youths come together for a 5-day program where they have many panel sessions and discussions. It's essentially sort of like a training program on climate issues. And we get to interact with policymakers, for example, Singapore's Climate Change Ambassador, as well as officials from the Public Utilities Board, also Ministry of Trade and Industry, working on different aspects of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And of course, trade related to climate issues. And we also had visits to understand Singapore's work, for example, turning waste to energy in incineration plants. And for example, Singapore's oil rig industry trying to become greener by building solar panels that are offshore. And the intention of this program is to eventually allow everyone in the program to come together to form a community that will continue to make policy recommendations to the government and also help spread awareness about the government's programs to the public. So out of the 40 participants last year, 20 were selected to go for COP29. So 10 people went in each week. And I think in the audience, there's also Lindy, who also went as part of the Singapore youth delegation, but in the second week. So you can also talk to her about what happened. Yes. And this was the Singapore Pavilion. Basically, the youth at the Singapore youth who went to COP29 were expected to run programs at the Singapore Pavilion, and you'll see that the Singapore Pavilion featured orchids, which were 3D printed. So it had quite a nice design and had some plants, which is very characteristic of Singapore, being a city in nature. Yeah, so it was quite a popular pavilion with tea and coffee at certain times, as well as badges featuring orchids and otters. Yeah, so that was very cute. And one other feature of the pavilion that was very interesting was New Brew, which is beer made from new water. And new water is essentially sewage water that has been treated into drinkable water. So what I would do is that I was on pavilion duty for about half a day during the week, and I could invite people to come and talk to me. So I would offer them beer. And then after we start drinking the beer, 5 minutes into it, I will tell them that, oh, it was actually sewage water in the past. So they would get a shock because they are not as in tune about the idea of new water as much as Singaporeans are, because it's been around for 10, 15 years now. So that was quite a fun thing to do. Yeah, and basically just trying to form networks through these conversations with people from different countries. Oh, and in talking about pavilions and coffee, the Australian pavilion had the best coffee, so that was very popular. So the guests from Australia, you can be proud of your country. Yes. Yeah. And let's see. Yeah, so at the Singapore Pavilion, I thought one of the biggest days that the pavilion had was the Finance Day, which is also to tie in with the idea that COP29 is a finance COP. And really what is in line with Singapore's prerogative, or rather Singapore's priorities, is that we want to become a finance hub, especially for decarbonization projects in Asia. And so two important initiatives were launched during the Finance Day. One is the FAST-P partnership platform, which is basically the Singapore government pledging 500 million US dollars in concessional funding. The idea being that they would be able to use this money to match private sector funding to support decarbonization and climate resilience efforts. So promoting the idea of blended finance. And eventually with this 500 million US dollars, the idea is to raise up to 5 billion US dollars. And of course, since the launch, there's also been a network of partners with other development banks like ADB and International Finance Corporation to work together to promote this finance initiative. And the second initiative that was quite important was the Transition Credits Coalition. It has been around for a while now and has produced an interim report to talk about how transition credits could have higher integrity and how the transactions could be replicable by having certain ways to structure the transactions and how to meet buyer needs by evaluating their needs and having engagements with them. So the intention is to undergo another 2-year study, which will be completed, I think, by the end of 2025. Yeah, so we would expect to see some solutions about transition credits coming out of that, because transition credits basically are to allow the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. And it's sort of a subset of carbon credits, but the concept is still quite new, and there are pilot projects around early retirement now, but the methodology around transition credits has not been solidified yet. So this is something that Singapore is looking at. Yes, and for the youth, basically we were running programs in groups of 5. And this is a panel I moderated about climate action and biodiversity, where basically we had speakers from different countries. In the case of this panel, speakers from South Africa, Egypt, and Tuvalu, talking about how youth act in relation to biodiversity efforts. So it was great to hear from them and also to use the chance to speak to other youths from other countries. And I think what stood out to me during this session was that for some countries, particularly the COP host nations like Azerbaijan and the UAE, it is very common to see sustainability as linked to a big conference. So the way to promote sustainability in the country is to use the COP to do so. And I thought that was a rather general and kind of top-down way to do it. But of course, in some of the speakers' countries that we saw, there's definitely more work with the communities. In the same first week that I was there was also a session about storytelling. So getting people from the Yango, the youth constituency in COP to talk about how to get stories across. And there was also an influencer on science in Singapore. So so that session was a different topic. But basically the idea was to cover different topics and invite youths from different countries so that we could cover more ground. And there are also some sessions from the second week. And also, if you see the picture on the right, this is a chance where our Singaporean youth also got to speak at the Children and Youth Pavilion, basically to share the stories about climate adaptation and mitigation in Singapore. And there were also youths from, for example, Hong Kong and the Philippines talking about the situation. And of course, for the Philippines, it was about the recent typhoon then. So there were quite a number of these pavilions to allow the youth to speak up. And then Brazil had a pretty big pavilion because it's the next host. China also had quite a big pavilion. The Ukrainian pavilion I thought was very heart-wrenching, but also very also very well done in terms of how it evoked emotions, because basically they tied their energy efforts to or rather their electricity regeneration efforts to their recovery from the war. Basically having this damaged solar panel on display and talking about how trying to repair the hydroelectric dam is a way of recovering from the war as well. And at the green zone, the impression that Azerbaijan gave was that they were very interested in building a white city that was sustainable. Basically, it will be a very big compound within Baku, featuring residential, commercial, and recreational facilities. And this would be a contrast to their oil and gas history. And there was also a display of many renewable projects that were happening all around the country. And of course, features of their leaders talking about how the Black City centuries will turn white. And finally, there were also some advocacy actions going on. But I thought this was quite minimal in Azerbaijan. They were not very visible in the compound, to be honest. And because the negotiations progressed so slowly, the traditional Fossil of the Day award was only given out starting from, I think, the Thursday or the Friday of the first week. So basically, there were less awards than usual. It basically was not very much advocacy going on around. So I think in terms of youth voices, these were more visible in the pavilions, but not in the advocacy actions. All in all, I think that this COP didn't seem very different or compared to other COPs in the sense that it's run-of-the-mill youth and other communities speaking up, but nothing very prominent happened at the COP. that was out of the blue. Yeah. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, for providing a on-the-ground perspective of the ongoings at Baku. And also glad that you were able to join as part of the Singapore delegation. All right, I'm going to now start opening up the floor to questions. And I really like to thank our online participants for being so patient. And so in that, as a gesture of appreciation, I would like to take the questions that have been posted. And so let's start with the first set of questions. It's from the last session.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. Okay, I can recall them. Thank God I have a memory. So the first question that we had from one of our participants was about the issue of climate change and indigenous peoples. The participant wanted to seek the views of the panelists on how COP29, what were some of the outcomes that may have positive or negative impacts on the rights of indigenous peoples? And perhaps I would start with Linda and then go around the table. Thank you.
Thanks,
2
Jo.
minutes.
Yeah, very quickly, I think maybe Lisa and Beatriz here would have more things to discuss in terms of indigenous people. But from what I heard in 2023, the COP28, there was a facilitation of work plan for indigenous people to elevate voices for IP and local communities in the climate action. And so they have 1 full year to discuss until COP29. And in 2024, they were supposed to have discussed the access for finance, climate access for finance for indigenous people. And so in COP26, the funding for indigenous people was agreed at $1.7 billion US. And this was reported in COP29 that it's been disbursed around 90%, but it's also recorded by the FWP, the facilitation or working group, that most of that 90% was given to consulting firms. So in reality, the indigenous people groups really probably didn't have enough access to the climate finance. So the hope here is that the next COP in Belém, COP30, it will be called the Indigenous Peoples COP, right, Beatriz? Yeah. So the indigenous people would have more leverage and more power to discuss specifically their access to climate finance. So this is very unfortunate because most of the lands that are used for mining and for extraction industries belong to these indigenous people. I give the floor to Beatriz.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think maybe I will highlight some of the things that are happening in Brazil, which I think are promising. In terms of indigenous people's rights, the issue is very much related to funding, if they have access to funding, even if they have access to funding to come to COPs, that it's in itself an issue because it's expensive, complicated, right? We see more and more their participation in COPs, and we saw that happen in COP30 as well, but it's always an ongoing issue of really trying to bring those people that should be in those discussions, right? So what we see happening in Brazil is an effort to bring funding to forest conservation, and this will also be beneficial to indigenous communities. So there is, with this new administration, we have a new, a new source of energy really being given to the Amazon Fund. I don't know if you have heard about it, but it's a fund in Brazil that gives a lot of money for indigenous communities and forest protection as well. So that this fund has been renewed with the new administration. We are doing things, for example, there is in the Brazilian Amazon, at the south of the Brazilian Amazon, an area is a lot of deforestation, illegal logging called the arc of deforestation. So there are plans of the government to transforming the arc of deforestation to the arc of restoration. So there has been a lot of funding being providing, for example, for the arc of reforestation, 346 million Brazilian reais being given to these funds. So I would say that with this new administration, there has been more momentum to create funding and access for forest conservation and for the protection of indigenous peoples as well. And as I discussed in my talk, I think COP30 will be also a forum where indigenous peoples' rights, forest conservation, nature-based solutions will be really at the forefront of negotiations, being really recognized as important tools, very essential for any climate mitigation action. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And Lisa, 2 minutes?
So similar to what Beatriz said, I think the problem with indigenous peoples in the Philippines is also access to funding, given the the low education and awareness of these groups. Of course, non-government organizations or civil society tries to assist them, and there are also government projects or programs that are aimed at raising their at least status higher and bringing them to the negotiation table. But I think the reality is on the ground also. They are very vulnerable communities, and for development projects, most of the time they're actually the most affected. And I think it's important to also provide a mechanism to ensure that they're free, prior, and informed consent to projects that are occurring in their ancestral lands and their domains are actually being respected and being followed. But I think that's still the problem is still systemic, and the government lacks the capacity to monitor the implementation.
Thank you very much. And Carol, would you like to chime in on this?
Not for this question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I would also just add that perhaps what's really interesting in the area of indigenous rights is what I observe in the area of strategic climate litigation. Quite a number of the most significant landmark cases are actually being brought by indigenous peoples and indigenous youth members, like young people from indigenous communities. And it's actually really remarkable how the struggle for the protection of indigenous rights has really come together in the space of climate litigation. The next question I have, which I will just rephrase in a very straightforward way because it does get to the gist of it. Are there any legal tests to measure whether the NDC, a subsequent NDC, is more ambitious? And this is like a textbook question. I love it. So Beatriz, let's test your knowledge.
Okay, right. So maybe the quick answer to that question is the tool for measuring the effectiveness of NDCs is the global stocktake, right? But we need to wait 5 years, right, for every stocktake to take place. So what I think happens in practice is that there are a lot of environmental organizations that are tracking the progress and the overall progress of NDCs. So my guess is that work for more speedy, quick evaluation of how good or how bad NDCs are, this work of NGOs in particular will be quite important.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I will also point people to the fact that the Paris Agreement in Article 4.3 sets a qualitative standard. It says that it's about whether there is a you're supposed to the state is supposed to state an NDC to the highest of its ambition. It's nationally determined. So the legal test is a very subjective test, and that remains to be seen in the coming years. We have a question for Lisa. Lisa, the question to you is this: how do we measure the effective implementation of the NCQGs formulated during the COP29 across several projects in developing countries? Well, that's a tough one.
Well, like the Philippines, the government is very ambitious. They came up with the implementation plan for the NDC. So I think that would be how we can, check whether they are effectively implementing. Like part of the NDC implementation is actually, the implementation of climate finance into these plans and projects that are aimed at reducing emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change. And I said, so for me, I think this is one way because it's a government policy document, and the government is now presenting them. So they've conducted various consultations with various stakeholders, and so this is one way for us to track whether they are effectively implementing the climate finance goals in relation to the NDC implementation plan.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And the next question I have is for Linda. The question was from the audience, from the online participant, who wanted to ask whether Linda had any thoughts about strategies to disincentivize the coal lobby in Indonesia.
Yeah, I'm up all night thinking about this all the time. But like Indonesia is the second biggest coal exporter in the world. So it's very highly coal reliant in the country, and coal is subsidized specifically because of energy. So the biggest utility company the only utility company in Indonesia is using coal for 80% of electricity in the country. So given that, I think Indonesia is not the only one. There are other developing countries who are similarly in the same situation. So industry is based on supply and demand, specifically if there's like global politics or global instability, and then suddenly everybody wants to buy our coal, of course, demand is high, and then we up our supply. That makes sense, right? But actually, no. How do we handle that? How do we manage that? Is with awareness. Like, of course, awareness then will take years and years to build. That in governance term, how do you build awareness is probably most effective way is by enacting policies. So what kind of policies that are needed for this type of industry, right? That are somehow degrading the environment, but also benefiting for the country. Just for your information, projects that are aimed for transition from coal, transition from fossil fuels are very, very small in comparison to the export earnings from these developing countries. So my suggestion would be subsidy, cut the subsidy for this industry and put the subsidy somewhere else. Specifically for renewable energies and circular economies and, like more environmentally friendly projects that would make sense. But how do we do that? We need support, international support. And please cut the demand for coal also, if possible. So these things, again, it's very connected altogether. I would like to chime in on the NDC question. There is no legal impact for a country to even reduce their NDC, even though the Paris Agreement is suggesting that we need to be very ambitious. So countries who want to follow the bandwagon effect of the US and withdrawal from Paris Agreement don't have any legal arguments, really. Like, why do you want to walk out from an agreement that will let you determine your own commitments anyway? It doesn't make any sense. Well, again, I'm talking about my country, but it might also be an inspiration to other countries. But I think, yes, so awareness and very specific policies that would help renewable energy and other environmentally friendly in the country, environmentally friendly projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor to questions from the room. If anyone who has questions or comments, Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm with APCEL, and I think this question is a little bit ignorant. I just wanted to ask if COP29 was the finance COP and COP30 is the indigenous COP. Question is, how do these labels come about? Like, who makes these decisions? Are these descriptives that come after the direction of travel of the discussion happens, or are they decided way before? And on that note, like, how do people advocate help steer the agenda setting in deciding what the top 31 or 32 or 33 is to the extent that it isn't already decided? Thank you.
It's an excellent question on the politics of climate change. Maybe I'll start with Beatriz and then Lisa.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I think for Brazil, at least, labeling COP30 as the Indigenous People Forest COP was, it was almost like a political statement, right? After this disastrous administration that we had, we wanted to bring Brazil back to the international stage as a country that cares about the environment, will protect the Amazon and all that. So in a way, that's why we're bringing the new president decided to bring COP30 to Brazil with this agenda, really. We want to be back in business, be part of these negotiations. Brazil wants to lead those negotiations. And when we think of Brazil, we think about the Amazon, forest conservations, indigenous peoples. So I think the label comes together with that political drive to that really justified, I guess, this bringing again COP30 to Brazil, and very also historical because everything started in Brazil in 1992. So COP30 is a big COP, and it's going to be again in Brazil, first time in an Amazonian country, city. So all those things make us think of importance of forests, indigenous people who are so many in Brazil. So I think that's why we got that label there. Thank you.
Actually, I really don't know. I mean, I think the question for me also is like, if you set certain like themes for the COP, would it also disregard other important aspects of climate change negotiations? And so I think that's for me. Like I would venture, I guess, why these are set like this. It's because of the host country, right? And the drive of the host country, so they would be able to dictate the theme for each COP. So, but yeah, I would also wonder about what about the other aspects. Like they focus on climate finance this last year, but then what about the other aspects that they didn't even move a dent in the negotiations of? So
I think that's a really good question, isn't it? To define the exclusion of other important issues on the table. Carol, did you have any views on this?
Yeah, so I think there was a due date for the new collective quantified goal to be set by 2025, which is why finance was a really important agenda and had to be done by the COP29 in 2024. I also think that there's some politics going on between the current and the upcoming presidencies as well. So during the COP, it came up that the finance discussions were not progressing very well. And of course, we can see from the outcome that it's not very ambitious. And there was some discussion around how, because they had the Troika presidency where the previous COP, the current COP, and the future COP president will all come together to push the agenda. The sensing at some point was that the Brazilian presidency wanted to have more important decisions happen at the Brazil COP so that they could be recognized for the diplomacy, and therefore weren't very keen on pushing things in Azerbaijan as well. So this is some gossip from the COP.
One of the benefits of being on the ground. Thank you, Carol. On that note, I will call this event to an end, but I would like to first invite everyone to join me in a warm round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carol, for joining us so late in London. Thank you to the online participants for joining us. And for those of you who have trudged to the Bukit Timah campus at 9 a.m. in the morning, you will be rewarded with refreshments outside. Thank you very much.